Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. Here with one of our very favorite speakers, David Kruh. He's going to be talking about the Ponzi scheme, which I have heard him do before, and it's fascinating. So you're going to have a great time. It also just learned through the program description that it is synonymous with the pyramid scheme, which I did not know before. So I learned something even before you showed up on screen today, David. I would like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting this program. And yes, just like Marcia, let us know where you're coming from. David's got a presentation for about 50 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. I am going to turn the chat off during his presentation, and I'll turn it back on when he's finished with it so that you can chat with each other. But if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, the button at the bottom of your screen, to ask a question that I will moderate to David after his talk. So without too much further ado, I'd like to hand it over to David, again, author, historian, and speaker.
Thank you so much, Mina, and thank you for having me. And hello, everybody, on this rather classic New England spring day. I'm glad you could join me. Today, we're going to talk about this financial scam, one that was so outrageous, so audacious, and so bloody successful that today we still invoke the name of the perpetrator. His name, Carlo Charles Ponzi. Charles Ponzi was born in Parma, Italy in 1893. He was born of middle-class parents, and when he was of age, they thought it would be a good thing for him to go to university. But Charles was already kind of a dilettante and didn't do very well in school, and what they decided he needed was some toughening up. So they gave him $200, put him on a steamship heading for New York. Now, he lost that $200 in a shipboard poker game and arrived in America practically broke. And he kind of bounced around. He was in New York and in Pittsburgh and Providence and New Haven. He had very menial jobs as a kitchen help, a grocery clerk, a factory hand. And then somehow, and folks, this is the beginning of the legend, somehow he ends up here in Montreal working for the Banco Zarossi. Now, Mr. Zarossi, who owned the bank, named it after himself, had made a few bad investments, and maybe it was over a drink or two that he confided in Charles Ponzi of his plight. Charles Ponzi tells one of his friends, a fellow named Scarpini, about what Zarossi was going through. Now, Scarpini, let's remember that name because he's going to come back later in our story. What he does is he works out a little scheme to get Zarossi to forge a check as insurance, because what they're going to do is initiate a little bit of a plan to get more depositors in Mr. Zarossi's bank. They're going to offer 10% interest on any deposit. Now, back then, interest rates were maybe 3%, maybe 2%. So that 10% interest rate was coming from what we today call a pyramid scheme. You could only pay the old investors by getting new investors. And that's why Scarpini had Zarossi forge that check, because the whole thing could topple at any moment. And then Scarpini does something that's really nefarious. He gets Ponzi to cash the check. Zarossi had only done that check as kind of an insurance. Well, once Ponzi cashes the check, Scarpini turns him in. And that means that Mr. Ponzi will spend the next year or so at the St. Vincent de Paul Penitentiary. When he is released, he gets a job with a man who is looking to help 5 Italian laborers cross the border from Canada into Vermont. Basically, he was smuggling immigrants, and he was caught. and he was sentenced to 2 years at the U.S. penitentiary here in Atlanta. Well, this, by the way, is Mr. Ponzi's mugshot from Atlanta. When he gets released, he sort of kind of goes straight. He gets a job with a power and light company in Alabama, but he gets bored with that and he decides to head north. And he ends up here in Boston in 1919, which is a very interesting year, not just here in Boston, but in all of America. First of all, Prohibition is about to begin. That meant that the sale of liquor, beer, anything above like 0.5% would be illegal. It's also the end of World War I. Up to that point, one of the most devastating wars in world history. One of the results of that war was the horrific Spanish influenza epidemic, which took millions and millions of lives. It was also the time of the suffragette movement, which would finally, in America, yield an amendment to the Constitution allowing women the right to vote. It was also a time, thanks to D.W. Griffith and other influences around the country, of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And in Chicago, the trial of 8 players from the Chicago White Sox who had thrown the 1919 World Series in what became known as the Black Sox scandal. Here in Boston on January 6th, a molasses tank filled with 1 million gallons of gooey, thick, viscous molasses exploded, almost knocked down the elevated train along Atlantic Avenue. The Great Molasses Flood killed 21 people and injured dozens and dozens more. This is post-World War I Red Scare. The commies are hiding behind every tree America. Assemblies like this on the Boston Common, people listening to socialist and communist speakers, eventually leading some members of the Boston Police Department to try to form a union, which was met with a resistance by the state and city governments. Eventually, the men who left their service on the night of September 9th, 1918, in support of a union, they were all fired. And Boston found itself being policed by a regiment of the Massachusetts militia. These are really interesting times. Tensions between immigrants and Yankees, which in no small part were exacerbated by himself, James Michael Curley, here surrounded by the Yankees, and you can see they do not look happy that this Irish Catholic is now mayor of Boston. So I wanted to tell you all that to kind of set up the mood of both the city and the country as 1919 rolls through. So Ponzi arrives in Boston, in the area, and he rents a small apartment in Somerville in a triple-decker. He gets a job with the J.R. Poole Company, an importer-exporter, but he's fired after only several months. And that firing really rankles him. It also means he's out of work. And in his autobiography, which is a fantastic document, it shows how completely clueless the man was about who he was and what he was doing. But it's almost funny in that regard. But there's a very poignant moment when he talks about being on a Boston trolley. He's down and out, but he sees this woman, the lovely Rose Necco. And in his book, he calls her, quote, the greatest gift America bestowed on me. Well, Rose was so enamored with Charles, she got her uncle, who ran the Necco Fruit Company, to hire Charles Ponzi. Now, we do not know. There's no paper trail. There's no newspaper articles. We only know that the Necco Fruit Company went out of business about 6 months after Ponzi was hired. But this didn't deter him. Now he was married to Rose, and he wanted to make good. And Ponzi had an idea. Pretty good idea, actually. He called it the Trader's Journal. It was to be a loose leaf bound magazine, he said, with air quotes, and it would be tailored to different parts of the world. So you had a whole bunch of pages printed that talked about the importing and exporting into England. Here's another few pages on what the tariffs might be in America or in France. And depending upon who he was sending the journal to, he would customize their content. It's very much like what the web does today. Well, the Neckos will not invest, and things are not going well for the Trader's Journal. And here it is, it's late 1919, and Charles Ponzi is so desperate, he has to take out a promissory note so that the furniture dealer won't take the measly desk and chair and file cabinets that he has in his office. And that furniture dealer, Daniels, will come back to haunt him. But he's still plying this Trader's Journal. And one day, and boy, I wish I could have been there for this moment, because I like the way he describes it in his book. He opens an envelope from a correspondent in Spain, takes out the letter, and out floated a piece of paper that looked like this. It is an international reply coupon. And Ponzi looked at that coupon, and he looked at the office with the sparse furnishings, and he looked out his window of 27 School Street at busy School Street. And suddenly, Charles Ponzi had the epiphany. The angels suddenly rang out, and he had an idea, the $1 million idea that he had been looking for. And it would all involve the international reply coupon. So an IRC is part of an international agreement made in the first few years after World War I, in which all countries agreed to accept the IRC as payment for a return stamp to the country to which it was sent. So I'm in America, and I want to send a letter to Spain, as Charles did, but I don't want that person in Spain to bear the burden of having to buy a return stamp. So I go to my post office, I buy one of those IRCs, I slip it in the envelope, and then my correspondent in Spain gets to go to his post office, get a first-class stamp for return trip, and everyone is happy. But here's what Charles Ponzi figured out. So in America, a first-class stamp, the exchange rate might be, in America, 1 cent for every 10 lira. Okay, keep that. Also, in America, a first-class international stamp is worth 5 cents. So in Italy, every coupon is costing 2 lira. And that means that a coupon that costs 1 cent in America is worth 5 cents in Italy. So he takes his dollar. It's an experiment. He's got an uncle back in Parma. He sends his uncle this dollar. And the uncle buys 66 international reply coupons, which he ships back to Charles Ponzi here in America. Because those coupons are worth 5 cents here, but only 1 cent back in Italy, he can take those coupons and get $3.30 worth of stamps, because in this country, stamps are not legal tender. So what he had to do was he had to convert that $3.30 worth of stamps into $2.30 worth of cash. And he did that by taking a little piece off of the cost of the stamps. And that way it would be worth it to somebody to buy stamps from him. Well, what are we left with? We have taken that dollar here in America, sent it to Italy, brought it back in the form of IRCs, and we have got ourselves $2.10 or a 210% profit. Well, this excited him greatly, and he decided to form this company. Has hundreds of these certificates printed up. And you'll note the very ironic name of his company, the Securities Exchange Company. Yes, folks, the SEC. Now, he knows this is kind of a new, it is a new thing, and it's, it may sound a little sketchy. So he's very careful to go to people that he knows, people he might have worked with, people whom his relatives might know. He mostly worked within his own Italian immigrant community. And by January of 1920, he had sold $870 worth of coupons. And now, with word of mouth spreading, he hires agents and he offers to give them 10% of whatever they sell. Ponzi himself uses those coupons like cash. He goes to the butcher and he goes to the baker. He doesn't go to the candlestick maker, but he does go to a jeweler so he could buy a beautiful necklace for his beloved Rose. Word is spreading, and by February of 1920, he sold almost $5,300 worth of coupons because he did a very smart thing. He paid off his first investors early. And now, like wildfire, the word spreads, and more people start showing up at 27 School Street to give him money. That is Lucy Melly. She is a recent graduate of a secretarial school here in Boston. So, with those early payouts, more and more people begin to line up at the teller's cages. In fact, to keep up with all of the investors, he has to put all their information on note cards. Note, at this point, it's all a cash business. In fact, he was taking the cash and stuffing it into the drawers of the file cabinets and the drawers of the desks because he simply was taking in so much raw cash. He gets cocky. He announces that he's going to up the return on those certificates from 50% in 45 days to 100% in 90 days. Imagine that. He's going to double your money in 3 months, which means he will quadruple your money in just 1 year. So, with all of that activity, you can see that almost $30,000 worth in cash is now making its way into the Securities Exchange Company. And now the newspapers are starting to notice. Crowds are forming at lunchtime outside the building. And finally, somebody asks, what are all these immigrants doing lining up at this building? Something's got to be sketchy. Remember, post-World War I, it's time for the police to get involved. And a police investigator shows up with an assistant, goes up to the 5th floor at 27 School Street. Ponzi breaks out a blackboard, and with a piece of chalk, he patiently explains with diagrams and his great panache and verve how the SEC makes money. He did such a good job that when the presentation was over, the policeman bought some certificates. Up to this point, though, there's not a lot of interest in the Securities and Exchange Company, though, outside of the immigrant or working class. In fact, reporters, normally inquisitive fellows, the ones who had to fight their way through this crowd to get to across School Street to get to lunch, didn't seem to show any interest. And then something happened. In March of 1920, both Italy and Romania, which had great exchange rates, and France, where stamps were legal tender, excused themselves from the IRC agreement. We don't know why. It was an internal political thing, but those three countries are suddenly out of the running. And Italy, especially, you'd think would perturb him the most because that's where all of his relatives were located, and that's where there was such a great exchange rate. Well, this now got the attention of the Inspector General of the Postal Service, and he calls on Ponzi, and he trudges up those 5 flights to 27 School Street. Ponzi breaks out the blackboard, draws a diagram, and what do you think happened when the presentation was over? Yep, he bought $100 worth of certificates. Now there's actually just overflowing from these file cabinets. They're stuffing it in trash cans and in the file cabinets, and everything seems to be going well. And remember that guy back in Montreal, the one who double-crossed Ponzi by getting him to cash that check and then turning him in, Scarpini? He must have smelled the money from down on School Street. And next thing we knew, Ponzi now has a manager for his new New Hampshire office. He even bought Scarpini a new car and gave him some cash just to get the hell out of town. But this sobered him. It got Ponzi to thinking, maybe I shouldn't have all this cash sitting around in my office. But what do you do? Where do you put cash? Well, of course, you do what every other wise and sober Bostonian does. You put your money in the bank. And he decides also to stop paying off those mature certificates with cash. He now starts writing checks based on his balance sitting in his account at several banks, including this one, the Hanover Trust Company. But cry no tears for Mr. Ponzi. He was doing very well. He bought this gorgeous home in Lexington, which, by the way, is still there. And the owners patiently, every once in a while, they will get a doorbell rung, and it'll be somebody saying, "Is this the house?" And yes, I was one of those people, and they were very nice to me. He had 6 servants, not counting the chauffeur for his brand new locomobile. And then Charles Ponzi got to do something which every immigrant who had to leave his family dreams about. He brings his mother to America, first class, in a ship. Hasn't seen her in 17 years. Mama, I want you to meet Rose, my wife. Now, we historians, we use a lot of things to figure out not just what was happening, but how people were feeling. And I love this picture because the look of adoration between Charles and his beloved Rose, but would you look at the daggers that Mama Ponzi is giving Rose? Charles Ponzi was very busy. He really fancied himself a businessman. He bought shares in a construction company. He bought a macaroni manufacturer, joking, well, at least I won't starve. He also, strangely enough, bought stock in several banks. And in a seemingly altruistic move, he took out a $3 million insurance policy. So in the event of his death, all of his investors would be paid off. And this just, as the kids say, added to Ponzi's street cred. And it vaults his intake of money even higher, almost $500,000 by May of 1920. But look, you don't need an MBA to figure out the awful truth. We know that Ponzi was not dealing in international reply coupons at all. It was a classic pyramid scheme in which every dollar in is $2 out to pay earlier investors. You were robbing Peter to pay Paul, and eventually you're going to run out of Peters. There's the awful truth. There's the money that's coming in. And there's the money that you have to pay out. So by May, he has to pay out eventually, once those certificates mature. He's going to have to pay out almost $1 million, $900,000. So he needs an infusion of cash, and he wants to pay off his investors and get out of the business. And he's got a plan. Always had a plan. One thing about Charlie Ponzi, he never stopped thinking. So Ponzi, he goes to the president of the Hanover Trust, a fellow named Mr. Shemalinsky. Shemalinsky was something of a braggart. He claimed to have ties to the Polish government. I mean, he was kind of a blowhard, and Ponzi decided to leverage that. And he went to Shemalinsky and said, "Well, if you're so tight with the Polish government, how about they buy or they sell him, Ponzi, $10 million in certificates? I'll take delivery over a 6-month period, and then we can pay off our debts." The U.S. Postmaster explored this plan, not only said it's legal, but he said he would read that the post office would redeem $1 million worth of those coupons. But Shemalinsky gets cold feet. Maybe he suddenly realized, wait a minute, I'm the president of a bank. What am I doing here? And Ponzi was furious with him. Meanwhile, the money continues to roll in. You can't stop this tide of interest. We're talking about $2.5 million in the hold. And now Ponzi comes up with a plan, because he still has to get out from under that red line, folks. That's $500,000. I'm sorry, that's $5 million that's going to have to be paid out. So Ponzi meets with the Hanover board, tells them he wants to buy controlling shares in the bank. They refuse, but they agree to sell him to keep him placated, because, boy, this man has a lot of money sitting in their vaults, which they need for their investments. They agreed to sell him just enough that's short of a majority. What they didn't know is that Ponzi had lined up the votes of 6 stockholders. And before they knew it, there was a new director of the Hanover Bank, one Charles Ponzi. So now, as an official of the bank, he has access to millions of dollars. Now, what I'd like to point out now, quick sidebar, is Ponzi could have cut and run at this point. He really could have, and probably gotten away with it. There are lots of places that didn't have extradition with America, but he thought with the bank directorship, things were going well, and he had a way out because he was working on another plan. Oh, and then look who shows up. Remember that furniture dealer, that guy named Daniels? Well, Ponzi had paid off the IOU. It was like a $50 IOU for the furniture back in the days of the Trader's Journal. But on July 3rd, Daniels files a $1 million lawsuit. $1 million, that was a lot of money back then. He claims in his lawsuit the IOU made him an investor in the SEC, and therefore he was entitled to a share in the profits. Now, as As ill-conceived and as wrong as that lawsuit may have been, it still would freeze all of Ponzi's assets. So Ponzi begins racing around town, scrambling to retrieve money from the banks before the regulators get to those accounts, and shut him out. He also hires Arthur Hill, who is a well-known defense attorney. Okay, now finally the newspapers are interested because a $1 million lawsuit gets attention. This is Edwin Grosier. He is the editor of the Boston Post, which was right around the corner from 27 School Street, right there on Washington Street. This was a time in Boston's history when so many newspapers were lined up along Washington Street that it was known as Newspaper Row. And he dispatches a reporter to interview Charles Ponzi, because a story about the lawsuit would appear on the Sunday, July 4th newspaper, in which Ponzi claims he has $2 million in assets and that he was not concerned about being sued for such a large sum of money. So, what do you think happened that Monday morning when the SEC opened for business? This crowd is, well, maybe some are there to withdraw, but most are there wanting to buy. The logic being that only a rich man could be sued for $1 million. So by July, he's got $6 million in, which means, simple math, that's about $12 million that he's going to have to pay out. That number just keeps getting bigger. But Ponzi still has that bank directorship, and his assets may have been frozen. But with a new account, any new money coming in, he can use. So what he wants to do is to bolster how much money is sitting in the bank vaults here at the Hanover Trust. So he engineers a contest for new bank investors. To help promote the contest, he hires this fellow. This is Bill McMasters. Bill is a former newspaper reporter who went into the PR business. And Bill glad hands a few people, and kind of ironic, one of the newspapers that prints a very positive story about Charles Ponzi is the same newspaper that reported on the lawsuit, the Boston Post. McMasters was so good that he got this puff piece. But he also does something. Well, you tell me if you think this is crazy. He convinces Ponzi to proactively meet with these guys, the attorney general and the bank commissioner. I mean, look at those faces. What does Ponzi have to worry about? So he trudges up to the State House, where they meet at the attorney general's office, and their minions and their lawyers and their sub-lawyers. And when the meeting was over, yep, a few people who were there to be schooled by Ponzi bought certificates. And McMasters now arranges, because of this meeting, another positive story in the papers. One of them calls Ponzi the Pied Piper of School Street. And that's, to me, what this picture looks like. The story has quotes from New York financiers, quote unquote, proclaiming Ponzi a genius. And Ponzi is cheered when he shows up for work. 3 cheers for the greatest Italian who ever lived. What about Marconi? Ponzi is said to have responded. He invented radio. Somebody in the crowd went, yeah, but you invented money. So now things are going great. The money's coming in. He's got that directorship. He's got some money in the bank in case he needs to lean on it. And it would appear that Edwin Grosier was in battle with his own paper, because soon after this, the Boston Post publishes an article with a devastating question from a man named Charles Barron. You might have heard of Charles Barron. He put out a little weekly that I think is still in publication these days. He asked this question, and I'm sure most of you have already thought the question out. Why does a man who gives you 400% a year put his money in a bank where he's only getting 4.5%? It's a great question. Ponzi's reply is to sue Clarence Barron for $5 million. And he proudly states that when he wins the lawsuit, all that money is going to go to charity. But now the district attorney, another Yankee, by the way, is getting involved because he's had enough. And he joins with the attorney general and the bank commissioner. And they ask Ponzi, they ask him nicely but firmly, stop selling certificates while we examine your books. Now, you still have to pay off mature certificates or refund money for anyone who wants out. But you know what? This is great. This is great because as long as he can pay out mature certificates or pay out certificates that are not mature, and by the way, that's face value, $1 for every dollar, he'll actually save money because that's fewer certificates that he'll owe double on later. So word spreads of the investigation. There's a $3 million run on the SEC. Many cashing in certificates before maturity. Again, that's good. It saves him $1 on every one of those certificates, but he's still solvent. Because remember, as long as he pays off, there's no case against him for fraud or for theft. So once again, this roller coaster ride with Mr. Ponzi, things are looking up. But then the Hanover board, nervous that he might cut and run, they forced Ponzi to buy a $1 million certificate of deposit. Now, that's money he really can't afford to spend. But he does it anyway because he needs that directorship. Then a few days later, another article in the Post, which details the difficulties they're having with their books, the books of the SEC. But this article features, I think they buried the lead because they had this quote from the New York Postmaster, who said that there aren't enough coupons in the whole world to account for the profits that Ponzi says he's making. And in fact, he said, looking at his big book, we only see $360 worth of coupons sold in New England and New York in the last 3 months. And this finally gets the attention of this guy, the governor of Massachusetts, who was days away from the vice presidential nomination, thanks to that police strike. And he orders Edwin Pride, a renowned accountant here in Boston, to go over Ponzi's books. And now comes another "you can't make this up" event in our story. Because the next day, an article appears in the Boston Post on August 3rd, 1920, saying that Ponzi was $4.5 million in debt, that he did not have the cash to cover every certificate. And that column was written by Bill McMasters, Ponzi's PR guy, who really wanted to get back into the newspaper biz, and now he had his scoop. And now all hell breaks loose. It's front page news. I love this cartoon. Poor Ponzi lifting up his pot of gold. I am still solvent. Trust me. And somehow he manages to survive a 3-day run on his company. But he still needs more money to keep paying people out. Because again, as long as nobody says they didn't get paid, they can't arrest him. But things start to happen really fast. On August 8th, Ponzi bribes several members of the Hanover board so he can borrow against his CD, which is totally legal. It was illegal back then. It's illegal now. A CD is locked in place, but now he has cash to keep going until this Edwin Pride audit is over. He's also figured out a plan to cover the $4.5 million that he was short. What he was going to do was use money in the Hanover Bank as kind of like a bridge loan. Like he'll move the 4.5 million from other accounts into his account. Pride would look at it and say, oh, look at this. There's 4.5 million, but he's solvent. And then Ponzi, claiming he would then put the money back. But on August 9th, and by the way, that plan might have worked. But on August 9th, Edwin Grosher gets a phone call. Maybe from Scarpini, maybe from Zarossi, we don't know. But the phone call tells him all about the shenanigans that went on in Montreal. So Grosher calls the Montreal police and says, we got this guy named Ponzi. They say, oh, we had a guy named Ponzi. I wonder if it's the same Ponzi. Tell you what, we'll send you a mugshot. So now knowing that he's going to get a mugshot of this fellow Ponzi, Edwin Grosher calls Charles Ponzi for a comment. And for the first time in his life, Ponzi has nothing to say. All Ponzi can do is hope that the audit is completed before the mugshot gets printed and his credibility disappears, and also while he still has control at the bank to be able to move that 4.5 million. But that same day, Edwin Pride, who was having so much difficulty, I mean, the guy was a financial genius, this Edwin Pride, but he just could not figure out his books. So he asked Ponzi to shut down everything. Well, is this not the best news ever? The league has been stopped by the government. Ponzi can look with all sincerity at Boston and say, folks, I wanted to give you your money, but the Yankees wouldn't let me. And now it looks like he's going to get away with it. But on August 10th, the bank commissioner gets wind of the bribe of the Hanover board, and he orders the bank shut down for the investigation. Well, there's your worst possible news. There's no money available to him to cover the $4.5 million shortfall, but it doesn't matter anyway. Because the mugshot arrived in Boston, and it was put in the paper, and it was revealed that Ponzi, spelled with the S in this case, he was actually a swindler, a 2 times over jailbird, and why would you trust this man? The next day, Edwin Pride calls Ponzi to his office to go over the audit. And he says to him, you are $4.5 million in the red. Have you the funds to cover the shortfall? And Ponzi says, no, I do not. And he turns to the U.S. Marshal behind him and says, I guess this means I am your prisoner. This was the biggest story since the molasses flood back in January. Ponzi was first tried by the feds. And then before his release, before his state trial, he jumps bail. And he heads to Florida and gets involved. This is no joke. He gets involved in the Florida land boom, selling land that was literally underwater. When that started to fall apart, he wanted to fake his suicide by leaving his clothes on a Jacksonville beach. Instead, he hopped a steamer to New Orleans. So, what the true nature of Ponzi, part of it, I think what I'm about to tell you, kind of proves that part of it was he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. Because he's on his way to New Orleans, and then he can maybe disappear into America somewhere. But he tells a shipmate who he is. And at this point, he was nationally famous. The shipmate goes to the captain. They wire New Orleans, and a sheriff was waiting for him at the dock. He would end up being held at the Charlestown State Prison. And in 1934, Charles Ponzi was deported. He was deported to Italy as a parting gift to us. As they walked him up the gangplank, he turned around and gave the Nazi salute. Thank you so much, Charles, for that. In 1939, he went to work for this man to run Mussolini's Italian airline. And he would be put in charge of the Rio de Janeiro hub of the Italian airlines. But unfortunately, the retirement benefits with Il Duce were not very good, and Charles Ponzi ended up out of work again. He ran a brothel for a while, sold food from a cart, and he wound up in this charity ward in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He died there at the age of 71. Ponzi's beloved Rose divorced him soon after his deportation, and she had an interesting life. She worked for the mob as a collector, and among the many places where she picked up protection money was the Coconut Grove, and she was there just hours before the 1942 fire that killed almost 500 people. She later worked in New York for a nightclub owner by the name of Lou Walters. You may know of his daughter, Barbara, who actually remembered Rose Ponzi. Rose eventually remarried and lived happily into her 90s. Edwin Grosier's Boston Post would win a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the Ponzi scheme. And of the investors, the lucky ones got back a few cents on the dollar. Most walked away having lost everything. As for the rest of us, we got smarter. I mean, there's no way we would ever again fall for such an obviously crooked pyramid scheme. Am I right? Folks, that's our talk for today. I'm going to turn back on my video and look forward to any questions we have.
Hi, Dave. My video isn't coming back on, but can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, that's so funny. There we go. All right, so that was wonderful as always.
Thank you.
Somebody asked, how is this different from the current day stock market? Is there enough money even in the US banks to pay out all of those who have kept their savings there?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's very different from the stock market in that that's why there is an SEC, at least the Securities Exchange Commission that we have today, to try to ferret out people who do things like that. That's how they managed. That's how they caught Mr. Madoff, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was curious about, do you think is this something new that started with Ponzi, this sort of pyramid scheme thing, or is did he?
No, it was around for decades before that. There was a fellow named Miller, who became very famous, and I'm very sorry I don't remember her name, but there was also a woman in the 1880s who was she did a terrific job of perpetrating one of these pyramid schemes, but both were eventually caught.
Mm-hmm. And you said that Ponzi kind of got caught mostly because he just couldn't keep his mouth shut.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true for the other ones too, or is that
hubris plays a great role in the downfall of many people. You know, the investigators. Another project I was working on, talking to some U.S. Marshals, they say the same thing. They say criminals don't change their behavior, and they also, it's going to sound funny, but, give me credit, man. To perpetrate such a big crime and not be able to tell somebody. It's one of the reasons I think this, the Isabella Stewart Gardner crime, how we haven't heard where those paintings are. To be able to keep that secret, Who can hold on to that secret that long?
Yeah. And you also said that Ponzi had at least a couple of opportunities to like just step out and not go to jail, and he
Yeah,
just never did. Was that also part of hubris or kind of
absolutely. At least I'm not a psychologist, uh, but it just seems like he wanted to be the big shot. That's what he wanted to be. He wanted to be the guy who would there's a story in the middle of the last couple of weeks. He goes to the theater and he's there to see Gentleman Jim Corbett. What a lot of boxers did back then is they did the vaudeville circuit, and they would appear on stage and they do a little boxing and they tell a few jokes, and Corbett would actually sing Irish tunes. I would love to have seen that act. Anyway, Ponzi goes to the theater and he shows up in the box, and when he gets noticed, the audience applauds. How do you walk away from that? It's that sort of adulation, and I think so. That's what makes me believe that hubris played a great part in this.
Yeah, and when he fell, he took a lot of people with him. When I think of Bernie Madoff and the millions and millions of people that were, well, the millions of dollars that were scammed out and people just being ruined, was it similar to that? Were people really ruined by this?
Well, the money that Madoff was getting was, here's $1 million. It was a lot of high rollers giving big money because, however many millions they had, that wasn't enough, which sort of, to me, compounds the nature of their greed. Most of what of the people who were involved buying SEC, the original SEC coupons, they were poor and middle class people. Not a lot of Yankees walking up 5 flights up the stairs to 27 School Street.
Yeah. Marcia says this is one of the best presentations she's ever seen. And yes, it has been recorded, and I will share that video link to everybody after in a little bit.
And so for the purpose of, just let's point out, this is not a how-to presentation. If anyone from the real SEC is listening, this is simply a historical talk.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Don't try this at home.
And if you do, don't be so like hubrisy.
Yeah. Forget my name.
That's right, exactly. Okay, so David will be back with us in October for a discussion about the Great Fires of Boston. I can't wait for that one. I will send that information out in the recap email. And David, as always, wonderful talk. Just learned so much, and I really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Mia. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Goodbye, everybody. Have a wonderful day.